Every outlet that covered the moment a Chinese tanker turned back from the Strait of Hormuz told you the same story. China blinked. The US Navy held the line. The blockade worked. That framing is not wrong. But it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously, and the piece that is missing is the piece that tells you how this crisis actually ends and what it costs everyone before it does. The story most coverage is not telling is not about the tanker. It is about the 11-minute window between the moment the Rich Star adjusted course toward the enforcement corridor and the moment it reversed. That 11-minute window contains a decision architecture, a set of rules of engagement, escalation thresholds, and communication protocols that the United States Navy executed in real time on a live confrontation with a vessel linked to the world's second-largest economy without firing a single round. And the fact that it worked the way it worked tells you something fundamental about the balance of power in that strait right now that no official statement from Washington, Beijing, or Tehran has yet been willing to say plainly. Stay with me, because the response was not just instant, it was calibrated, and the calibration is the story. To understand what that 11-minute window means, you first need to understand what it was sitting on top of, because this confrontation did not begin when the Rich Star made its move. It began unfolding on April 13, 2026, when the United States Navy executed a blockade of Iranian maritime infrastructure at a scale and speed that military analysts covering the region describe as the most compressed naval enforcement action in the post-Cold War era. In a single operational window, Karg Island, through which 89% of all Iranian crude exports flow, was locked. The port of Bandar Abbas, the entry and exit point for an estimated $43 billion in annual Iranian maritime trade, was locked. Chabahar, the port Beijing spent $400 million developing specifically to bypass the Hormuz corridor and access Central Asian trade routes without American interference, was locked. 190 million barrels of Iranian oil already loaded aboard vessels sat stranded at sea with no legal port of call that would accept them. 3 carrier strike groups, the Abraham Lincoln, the Gerald R. Ford, and the George H.W. Bush, were either operating in theater or within 72 hours of reaching it. Over 50,000 American military personnel, continuous F-35C and FA-18 combat air patrols, P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, sweeping every surface contact within 400 nautical miles, submarine coverage beneath. The Rich Star did not approach a blockade line. It approached the most concentrated demonstration of American naval power assembled in that geography since the 1991 Gulf War. That is the context in which the 11 minutes happened. The Strait of Hormuz is not a wide-open ocean corridor where naval forces have room to maneuver, position, and project. It is a navigational bottleneck 33 nautical miles wide at its narrowest functional point. The designated shipping lanes themselves are only 3 nautical miles in each direction, with a 3 nautical mile separation zone between them. 6 nautical miles of usable transit corridor for roughly 21 million barrels of oil per day. That is the physical reality of the choke point. At that width, a vessel transiting the inbound lane is operating within visual range of Iranian coastal positions on the northern shore. The Iranian shore is not empty coastline. It hosts the Bandar Abbas naval complex, which even after the degradation inflicted by Operation Epic Fury retains coastal missile batteries. It hosts radar installations. It hosts the remnants of what was, before April 2026, the world's largest fleet of fast-attack naval craft, an asymmetric warfare capability specifically designed to harass and threaten vessels transiting exactly this geometry. The southern shore is Omani territory. Muscat has maintained studied neutrality throughout this crisis, granting neither side formal basing rights and asking both sides, through quiet diplomatic channels, not to turn its coastline into a confrontation arena. What this geography means in practice is that there is no alternative route for the oil. The Strait of Hormuz is the only exit from the Persian Gulf. There is no second channel. There is no bypass. The east-west pipeline across Saudi Arabia, the Petroline, can move approximately 5 million barrels per day when running at full capacity against a daily Gulf export volume of 21 million barrels. The math does not close. For every economy that depends on Gulf oil, Hormuz is not a trade route. It is the only route that exists. And the U.S. Navy in April 2026 made itself the gatekeeper of that route. That is what the Rich Star was sailing toward. Here is what the mainstream coverage of the Rich Star moment is consistently missing. The question everyone is asking is, did China blink? That is the wrong question. The question that matters operationally and strategically is, what did the U.S. Navy actually do in those 11 minutes, and why did it work? Western analytical platforms tracking the incident through AIS vessel monitoring and naval communications intercept data have reconstructed the sequence with reasonable confidence. When the Rich Star adjusted course toward the enforcement corridor at approximately 14:30 local time, two things happened simultaneously aboard the nearest American surface combatant. A radio hail on the International Distress Frequency Channel 16 was broadcast identifying the vessel by name, citing its heading and speed, and informing the bridge that it was approaching a designated naval enforcement zone under authority the U.S. Commander 5th Fleet had formally declared 72 hours earlier. Simultaneously, an E-2D advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft already circling the operational area redirected its radar coverage to generate a continuous real-time track of the Rich Star, feeding that track to every surface and subsurface asset in the task group. The Rich Star did not respond on Channel 16. It maintained course for approximately 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, a second radio hail was issued. An F/A-18F Super Hornet, already airborne on combat air patrol, was vectored to a position that placed it on a visible intercept heading toward the vessel. Not a threatening pass, a visible presence. A demonstration that the vessel had been acquired, tracked, and that an asset with the capability to act on that track was now within visual range of the bridge. The Rich Star reversed course 2 minutes after the Super Hornet became visible on the horizon. It did not fire a shot. No warning shot, no collision course, no physical boarding attempt. The American response was, "We see you, we have communicated with you, and we are now demonstrating in the most concrete possible terms that we have the capability and the authority to act." The tanker's bridge crew made a rational decision. The most important thing about that decision is not that it happened, it is that it happened inside 11 minutes, without escalation, without incident, and without creating the confrontation that Beijing had been quietly hoping might generate the international sympathy it needed to challenge the blockade diplomatically. China did not get the incident it needed. America gave China the exit it needed to save face while delivering the message it needed to deliver. That was not an accident, that was doctrine. Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun issued a statement within 6 hours of the Rich Star's reversal. The statement said, and I am characterizing rather than quoting directly, that Chinese vessels had legal rights of passage through international waters, that Beijing had existing agreements with Tehran, and that the United States should not interfere in bilateral Chinese-Iranian commercial arrangements. Those words were broadcast on every Chinese state media outlet. They circulated through diplomatic cables to every Chinese embassy on Earth. They were designed to project authority. Let me tell you what those words actually accomplished in material terms. Nothing. Not one additional tanker moved through that corridor as a result of them. Not one barrel of Iranian crude reached a Chinese refinery because Dong Jun stepped to a podium. The numbers explain why. China currently imports 10.2 million barrels of crude oil per day. Of that total, roughly 40%, approximately 4.1 million barrels daily, transits the Strait of Hormuz from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait and Qatar, in addition to the Iranian volumes now blocked. China holds strategic petroleum reserves estimated by the International Energy Agency at approximately 930 million barrels, equivalent to roughly 91 days of total import requirements. That reserve begins drawing down the day the blockade holds. At current consumption and alternative sourcing rates, Western energy analysts tracking Chinese refinery intake data estimate Beijing has between 80 and 110 days before the drawdown starts generating visible pressure on domestic fuel prices and industrial output. The clock is running. It started on April 13th, and Dong Jun's words did not add a single hour to it. If this is the analysis you have been looking for, the numbers behind the headlines, the doctrine behind the response, subscribe now. What comes next is the part that tells you how this ends. And the three possible endings are not equal. Beijing now faces a menu of 5 options in response to the blockade and the Rich Star outcome, and none of them resolves the core problem cleanly. The first option is direct naval confrontation, dispatching People's Liberation Army Navy surface combatants to the strait to escort Chinese-flagged commercial vessels through the enforcement corridor by force. China does have a military logistics base in Djibouti, established in 2017, approximately 2,400 nautical miles from Hormuz. The plan has expanded its blue water capability significantly over the past decade and now operates 2 aircraft carriers with a third nearing commission. But the force asymmetry in theater is not close. 3 American carrier strike groups carrying a combined air wing of approximately 210 combat aircraft against a planned expeditionary force that would take between 12 and 18 days to transit from its nearest position to the strait, arriving at the end of that transit fatigued, logistically extended, and facing a combat air patrol architecture that has been operating on continuous rotation for weeks. American naval analysts with access to Pacific Fleet assessments have described this option on the record as non-viable under current force deployment conditions. The second option is gray zone escalation, Coast Guard vessels rather than Plian warships, civilian escort rather than military convoy, creating presence without crossing the threshold of formal military confrontation. This is the tactic China has used with documented success in the South China Sea against Philippine and Vietnamese patrol assets since 2012. The problem is the threshold is different. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel shadowing a commercial tanker toward a U.S. Navy enforcement corridor is not equivalent to a Chinese Coast Guard vessel shadowing a Filipino fishing boat near Scarborough Shoal. The asset on the other side of the line is not a 97-meter patrol vessel. It is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer carrying 96 vertical launch cells. The gray zone does not work when the counterparty's gray zone is significantly above your military ceiling. The third option is economic and diplomatic retaliation, UN Security Council vetoes, treasury dumping, supply chain weaponization in the sectors where Chinese market dominance is real. Beijing holds $762 billion in US Treasury securities as of the most recent TIC data. Selling that position aggressively would generate dollar weakness and treasury yield spikes that would damage American financial markets. It would also damage the $3.60 trillion in Chinese foreign exchange reserves denominated in dollar-linked assets simultaneously. China's economic retaliation tools cut in both directions at the worst possible moment, when its own domestic economy is absorbing the energy shock of a blockade. The veto at the UN does not move oil. The fourth option is patience, absorbing the damage, drawing down reserves, halting Chinese fuel re-exports to Japan and South Korea to ensure regional rivals absorb simultaneous pressure, and waiting for American logistical sustainability to become a political problem in Washington. This is what Beijing is actually doing. It is the least bad option available. It is not a solution. It is a calculation that time and allied fractures might create a diplomatic opening that direct action cannot. The fifth option is the long game, accelerating the China-Pakistan economic corridor through Gwadar port, which when fully operational could theoretically pipeline Gulf crude into Xinjiang without touching Hormuz. Full operational capacity of that corridor is not projected before 2031 under the most optimistic construction timelines Chinese infrastructure publications have reported. It does not help refineries running low today. American power at Hormuz is real. It is also not unlimited, and the coverage of the rich star's reversal has not done justice to the structural constraints running beneath the operational success. Sustaining 3 carrier strike groups in a single operational theater is not a condition the United States Navy has maintained for an extended period since the initial phase of the Iraq War in 2003. Aircraft carrier maintenance cycles, the scheduled depot-level maintenance that cannot be deferred indefinitely without degrading combat readiness, run on strict timelines. The USS Abraham Lincoln's last comprehensive maintenance availability concluded in October 2024. Western naval publications tracking carrier readiness cycles flag that her next scheduled maintenance window opens in the fourth quarter of 2026. Extended high-tempo operations delay that window at a cost to long-term readiness that the Navy has historically been reluctant to accept. Allied support for the blockade has also been narrower than Washington projected. The UAE and Bahrain announced formal support. The United Kingdom declined participation in the enforcement operation, limiting its contribution to mine clearance operations and humanitarian navigation assurance through a separate task group operating under a distinct operational mandate. France deployed its own independent navigation mission, explicitly decoupled from the American blockade framework. Germany and Australia declined participation entirely. The United States is running the most consequential naval operation of the 21st century with a coalition that consists, in practical enforcement terms, primarily of itself. That matters for duration. The blockade can hold. The question is how long it can hold before the logistical and political costs of holding it alone begin to create pressure in Washington that Tehran and Beijing can exploit. Iran's strategic position in this crisis deserves its own separate analysis, because the transformation it has undergone since Operation Epic Fury began is so complete that it redefines the country's options in ways that will persist long after this specific confrontation resolves. For 4 decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on a single irreplaceable deterrent, the credible threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. Every Western military planner who gamed a strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure had to factor in the response: Iranian mines, fast attack craft, anti-ship missile batteries on the northern shore that could close the strait and send oil prices past $180 per barrel within 72 hours. That threat was Iran's insurance policy. It was the reason the cost-benefit calculation on military action against the Islamic Republic's nuclear program kept coming back unfavorable for a decade and a half. Iran exercised that deterrent. Oil prices hit $151 per barrel within 96 hours of the closure. Fuel crises materialized across Southeast Asia. European energy markets spiked. The deterrent was real, and it worked exactly as Iranian planners intended. America's answer was not to reopen the strait and restore the previous equilibrium. America's answer was to take the strait away, clear the mines, establish a safe corridor, open Hormuz to all commercial traffic except Iranian exports, and lock every Iranian port behind a blockade that imposes $13.40 billion in monthly export revenue loss on the regime. Iran's weapon was turned into Iran's cage. That is not a temporary tactical shift. That is a strategic transformation that alters the Islamic Republic's deterrence calculation permanently. The historical parallel that the analysis community keeps returning to is October 1962, 13 days in the Caribbean, that ended when Soviet cargo ships approaching the U.S. naval quarantine line around Cuba received a radio hail, were tracked by American aircraft, and reversed course without a shot fired. The parallel is structurally precise: a naval cordon, a direct test by a vessel linked to the adversary power, a response calibrated to be unambiguous without being provocative. and a reversal that preserved the credibility of the line without requiring the escalation that crossing it would have demanded. But the 1962 parallel breaks down in one critical dimension that the coverage is not calculating. In 1962, Khrushchev had a back-channel direct communication through Ambassador Dobrynin and the Kennedy White House that allowed Moscow to receive private assurances before public reversal. The reversal could be framed internally in the Kremlin as a negotiated outcome rather than a capitulation. Beijing in 2026 does not have a comparable back-channel in operational condition. The trade war has degraded the bilateral communication architecture to a degree that makes the quiet off-ramp that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis significantly harder to construct. Dong Jun stepped to a podium because there was no private channel through which to step instead. 3 futures are now in play, and they are not equally probable. The first is negotiated resolution. Iran returns to the Islamabad framework, makes the nuclear concessions in language that allows the regime to claim it preserved sovereignty. China's quiet pressure on Tehran tips the calculation, and the blockade lifts within 60 to 90 days. This is the architecture Washington is engineering for. The $13.40 billion monthly revenue squeeze, the 91-day reserve countdown, and the domestic unrest that economic collapse accelerates are all levers designed to make this future Tehran's rational choice. The probability, based on the internal economic pressure now accumulating, is assessed by Western analytical platforms as the most likely single outcome, but only if the diplomatic window remains open and Beijing chooses to apply the private pressure it is publicly denying. The second is escalation. Iran activates the Houthis in Yemen. The Bab el-Mandeb is disrupted simultaneously with Hormuz. A Chinese convoy with quasi-military escort tests the blockade in a way that creates a confrontation neither side fully controls, and oil prices breach $170 per barrel, triggering the global recession that every central bank has been modeling and hoping to avoid. This future becomes more likely with every day the diplomatic window narrows. The third is prolonged standoff. The blockade holds but does not generate resolution on a timeline American political sustainability supports. Allied fractures deepen, and the crisis grinds forward for 6 to 12 months, permanently restructuring global energy markets, accelerating Chinese infrastructure alternatives, and leaving a regional architecture so damaged that the next confrontation starts from a more dangerous baseline than this one did. The prediction worth recording now as a matter of verifiable future accountability is this: China will establish a formal bilateral oil supply agreement with at least 2 Gulf Cooperation Council members denominated partially in renminbi within 6 months of this crisis resolving, regardless of which resolution path materializes. The Rich Star incident proved in public on the world's most watched waterway that Beijing cannot protect its energy supply lines through American-controlled corridors. That proof will accelerate GCC diversification toward renminbi settlement that Beijing has been seeking for 3 years and that Riyadh has been resisting. The crisis changed the negotiating leverage. The agreement will follow. What the 11 minutes of the Rich Star incident revealed is not that American military power works. Everyone already knew that. What it revealed is that military power and economic interdependence are not separate domains that can be managed independently on different timelines by different ministries in Beijing. China built its energy dependency on Iranian oil through a parallel system: the shadow tanker fleet, the Chabahar bypass, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization diplomatic cover, specifically designed to operate outside the frameworks American power could reach. The assumption embedded in that architecture was that the United States would not or could not act directly and comprehensively enough to close the entire system in a single operational morning. That assumption was wrong, and the cost of being wrong about a foundational strategic assumption is not measured in the price of oil on the day the assumption fails. It is measured in the years required to rebuild the alternative architecture that should have existed before the test came. The Rich Star turned back in 11 minutes. The strategic miscalculation that sent it toward the blockade line took 15 years to construct. The distance between those two numbers, 11 minutes and 15 years, is the real story of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, and the world is now watching, one tanker at a time, as the consequences of that distance are paid in full. If this analysis gave you something the mainstream coverage did not, subscribe. The next piece covers the economic cascade that follows if the blockade holds past 90 days and what it means for oil prices, inflation, and every market that priced this crisis as a regional event.